right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third Engendering Data webinar, but first in 2023. I'm Arago, Program Manager for the Methods module of the CGIAR Gender Impact Platform. Just before we begin, I'd like to briefly just talk about what engendering data is for those who are not familiar. So engendering data community was being managed by the PIM, CGIAR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets until the program ended in 2021. And last year, the Methods module revamped and we launched the space under the gender platform and kept the same identity as a space for researchers and partners to share questions and knowledge and discuss methods and tools for gender research related to agriculture and food systems. And last year, we published 4 blogs and 2 webinars under engendering data. And I can, after the introduction, I can add the link to the engendering data page in the chat. And more interesting contents are in the pipeline for this year. So please stay tuned for more information. And today's webinar is on leveraging mobile phone big data to estimate gender inequalities in labor market outcomes in Ghana. And it will be presented by one of the projects that was awarded our Gender Platform Innovation Grant in 2021. And we have 2 presenters for this webinar today. Lindy Follett is an assistant professor of business analytics at Drake University. She received her PhD in statistics from Iowa State University. And the second presenter is Greg Seymour. He's a research fellow with the Environment and Production Technology Division of IPRI, and he has a PhD in economics from American University. And as usual, just a quick reminder, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and feel free to add your comments and questions in the chat. And you can also raise your hand during the Q&A if you'd like to speak. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Greg to kick us off.
Thanks, Ara. Great. So everybody can see the screen that's working? Okay, yep. Great. So like Ara said, this is I'm presenting with Lindy. We're presenting on behalf of a larger project team. There's a lot of partners on here, IFPRI, Drake University, Dahlberg Data Insights, as well as the folks from we've gotten a lot of support from the Ghana Statistical Service and of course the Gender Platform, and then we're also getting some support from the Digital Innovation Initiative. Okay, so let me jump in, and there we go. Okay, kind of the primary motivation for that we see for this work is really in terms of kind of filling data gaps. So kind of, given the important role that women play in agri-food systems, we know that, we need high quality data on rural men's and women's labor for tracking progress on gender equality and women's empowerment. This comes through really strongly in the SDGs. It's also obviously, being able to measure these things, being able to measure labor is also obviously important for development and interventions that aim at gender inequality and women's empowerment. Although I think for kind of the purposes of kind of our aim with this project is probably more on the tracking over time, as opposed to like in the context of impact evaluation. So some of the most pressing gender data gaps that we have that exist still relate to kind of unpaid work, unpaid care and domestic work, earnings, informal employment, and entrepreneurship. This is coming out of a lot of work by Data2X and others. It's also something that's there's a recent paper coming out of the World Bank that talks about individual level employment data, being very scarce, thinking globally, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So I have a couple uh, facts here out of that only like 37% of all of the kind of year country observations on labor force participation globally, for the last 30-ish years are only a third of that is based on data from labor force surveys or censuses. So a lot of it is coming from other surveys and is that may not be quite as representative. And so that this paper in particular, this by Desiree and Coast actually has some really interesting comparisons across different surveys. DHS versus like the LSMS and then like censuses, and you can see actually that there's big differences. So having high quality data matters, and they can really show that difference. So again, so another kind of fact here is like only globally roughly a third of countries around the world did not implement a labor force survey or a household survey with a labor module from this over this like 10-year period. That's a third globally. In sub-Saharan Africa it's half. So there really is a data gap here that has to be filled to be able to track track progress. And so, what this means is there's a growing need then and this is coming out of a lot of different literature, to identify new data sources and methodologies to fill these gaps. And so that's where this paper comes in. So we're focused really on the digital technologies, and in particular mobile phone big data, or finding that there's lots of different ways to talk about these, to name these kind of data. So digital trace data is what we're going to go with, and so this includes, I have just a little description of kind of what these data are, because it's not going to be, I'm sure it's not familiar to everyone. So digital trace data, this includes call detail records. So that's all of the details of the mobile phone, like how the duration of calls, how often you're calling people. So these data are produced every time mobile phones are used to make calls, to send text messages, to browse the internet or use mobile money. So anytime you're using your phone, there's these data are being generated. So if you combine these data with metadata like timestamps and cell tower locations, then these data then capture kind of a wide variety of behaviors, including specifically some things around like mobility, and then how far you're traveling, how like in terms of like which cell towers are you're accessing when you place a call, and then also social networking. So how many unique, who are you calling? How is it the same people over and over, or is it a more diverse set of contacts? So some points from kind of past research. We do see kind of that there are gender differences in mobile phone behavior. One recent study by Dahlberg, pointed out that women tended to, I think this was coming from Bangladesh, but women tended to receive longer calls, have fewer unique contacts, and a smaller radius of gyration, meaning that they tended to not travel as wide of distances as men. So in terms of kind of like what others have done using these similar data, there's especially a kind of an emerging literature around using these mobile phone data and machine learning techniques to develop poverty maps. So there's a lot of there's actually, I mean, I have 3 studies here, but there's quite a few more where they're able to show that CDRs do kind of meaningfully correlate with poverty status. There's less on kind of other socioeconomic outcomes. I mean, there's a couple papers here on employment, but it's it's still a really small literature, and so we're trying to add to that. And in addition, kind of none of the existing studies focus gender. Gender isn't in the forefront for all of these. It's often something that is considered, but they're not specifically aimed at kind of gender research. So we're also trying to kind of expand, push literature in that direction as well. So this last point is kind of that I have here is more kind of acknowledging that there is a limitation to these kind of to using these data to understand gender dynamics, and it owes to this fact that women that there is a gender gap in terms of mobile phone ownership. So women in lower and middle income countries are 7% less likely than men to own a mobile phone. This is coming out of like the latest reports by GSMA. And this is, this gap is this is particularly the case for, women who are poor, less literate, unemployed, or live in rural areas. So this has, important implications for kind of, especially in kind of interpreting our work. So it means that we can't, the predictions that we're going to present, like we can't make predictions for the whole population, which would include these non-phone users. Unless that is, we find some way to correct for this this gender bias in phone ownership. And I think there are, there's some options there that we can come back to at the end about potentially reweighting if you had kind of population-wide data on phone ownership. But it's that remains to be seen if we can do that. So it's an important kind of limitation to keep in mind. Okay, so kind of what is our overall research objective then? It's really just this question of can digital trace data and machine learning be used to reliably predict gender labor market indicators. So that's what we're going to focus on. We have I'm going to go over in a few slides a few key kind of indicators we've identified, and as we're going to see, it's the preliminary results that we're going to present today kind of open up the question of, well, maybe the digital trace data on their own aren't doing that great of a job at predicting these indicators. And so we're also, as a next step, and I'll talk about this again later, we're thinking about different ways that we can improve the model performance. And so we'll talk about this all as we go on. I wanted to give kind of just a kind of a very broad overview of kind of the research of the project and also kind of where we are right now, to highlight that kind of we're still kind of in the middle of this. We're gonna, I'm going to talk about each of these boxes kind of in detail, but so we have basically two sources of data that are used to train and test the machine learning models. So we have the phone survey data with which we'll talk about in a second. It's a phone survey that we conducted with a random subsample of MTN Ghana subscribers. So this is MTN Ghana is the largest mobile operator in Ghana. This data, together, these data paired with these digital trace data, the CDRs, the mobile money usage, all of these different things that we alluded to a couple slides ago. We pair the phone survey data with the digital trace data for these subscribers, and together those models then are used to train and test a machine learning model. In this case, we have a couple of different models that we're estimating, that we're running. Lindy's going to talk about those. And then, so these are, that we have kind of like, we've done all this, and we have some preliminary results that we're going to present today. that are just based on these two, based on the phone survey data, and then the digital trace data for these subscribers. That's what we're going to present today. Still to be completed, in the coming months is, refining the model, especially in terms of like adding additional data, and then ultimately we want to, apply the model to to new data, to the parts of the subscriber base, to the entire subscriber base. That's going to give us, we'll produce based on that. We'll have kind of these predicted labor and market indicators for the subscriber base, and ideally we're going to present those in terms of as maps, because I think that's going to be the easiest, the most have the most utility for down the road for others. And it's in so yeah, so that's we're kind of, just to point out, highlight here that we're really kind of in the middle of this still, so bear in mind that the results you will see are very much still preliminary. Okay, so some details on the different pieces of data. So like I alluded to, we conducted a phone survey in February of last year. I can say that now, carried out by the Ghana Statistical Service, by a call center and a team of experienced enumerators. From there, the phone numbers were randomly selected from the MTN subscriber base. It's designed to be, roughly representative of mobile phone users and the rural urban areas of all like 16 administrative regions. Interestingly, and we could talk all day about the phone survey, but the GSS team just did a fantastic job. And one of the really, I think, innovative things they did was to send a text message to potential respondents, informing them that they're going to be contacted for a phone survey, but they didn't stop there, because they anticipated that there would be, there's a lot of privacy concerns. There's been a lot of phone scams apparently, and so they wanted to. We worried that if there wasn't some way to kind of increase the legitimacy of the survey, that the response rate would suffer. And so this text message included a contact number for someone at GSS that they could call to verify that this was legit, that there really was a survey coming out. And apparently, there were quite a few respondents who actually did contact this. So we like to think that this had this is one of the reasons why we were able to kind of achieve this, I have it down here, but a 62.5% response rate, which I think is very good in the context of how these kind of like random phone surveys usually bear out. So the survey included questions on, very short survey included, some basic characteristics, some questions on phone usage that I think are going to be interesting to look at, in terms of whether you needed permission to carry the phone or permission to use the phone, how often you carried it outside the home, whether you used it for business purposes, and whether or not this is the only phone or SIM card that you use. And of course, it also included some detailed questions about your work activities during the past 7 days. And these questions we'll talk about more, but they're all modeled on kind of like ILO standards. Overall, it was we kept it, we tried to keep it really short, and so the median interview time was about 7 minutes. The final sample was about just over 8,000 respondents, 43% of which were women. These were right on line with what we had targeted and what we thought would be enough to use to kind of develop, to train and test the machine learning model. Okay, so I have a few more details here on the types of digital trace data that are incorporated into the model. So one thing is to note is that we have the phone survey data for a one period of time, the digital trace data on the other, but can cover a wider, reference period. So it's covering actually about 3 months before and 3 months after the phone survey data. So all in all, based on kind of the underlying kind of the CDRs, the metadata, you have all of this information, and then we didn't do this, but Dahlberg did it. The team at Dahlberg process this data to create 204 variables, or we're going to call them features, based on these data for each user. And then it's kind of it's almost an infinite number of features you could calculate. These features in particular kind of are based, the selection of these features is based on previous analysis by Dahlberg. One very important aspect of mobile phone data to keep in mind is that the gender of the user is not captured in the data. So it has to be predicted. So why is it not captured? So it's, for very pragmatic kind of reasons where it's difficult for mobile operators to track gender successfully at the point of sale. So when the SIM cards or phones are sold. And this is, especially in markets where, where men are commonly registering for their wives and daughters. So it's their information that shows up on the registration rather than who will actually, use the SIM card. And also, in low income settings where the agents are often who are selling the SIM cards and phones are often operating in very basic facilities, and so tracking registration on paper. And so there's there's a lot of there's work on this that shows that kind of like the registered user of a phone, the gender of that is that the gender for that registered user is not always indicative, is often not indicative of the gender of the person who actually uses the phone. So you have to take this extra step when analyzing these data with a gender lens to actually predict gender. Okay, so the types of data in particular that are are captured here, we have kind of 5 buckets, like CDRs, and that's including like the voice calls, text messages, data usage. And so some of the examples of features here that we're talking about are kind of like the total number of voice calls made, the total number of incoming voice calls, outgoing voice calls, the average duration of voice calls. And we can look at these things, and we do, in terms of like whether it happens on a weekend or a weekday, whether it happens in a morning or the evening. And so you have many different variations of these features. We can do the same, we have text messaging, so it's the same similar things. You can, I think one of the interesting, I think it's really interesting, is that one of the features that you can calculate is like the amount of time it takes for someone to respond to a text message. So we have some things related to that. Data usage. So this is kind of like how much data are you using, the total number of data transactions, total volume of data used. Mobile money, it's a lot of the, we have, then a great deal of information here too, where in terms of, you have information on the phone numbers for payments being like where you sent the money, where you received, from who you received the money, the amount of the transaction, whether there are any fees or commissions. And of course you have like the, the cell tower that process the transaction and timestamps. And so there's, a variety of a number of features around mobile money. Data purchases are kind of a separate category, like how often are you topping up your data, and by how much. All of these things are, we have features related to them. And then you have the physical mobility, which is based on the cell tower that is the cell tower that you're connecting to when you do place a call, send a text, use mobile money. And there's information then that can be calculated based on around that kind of, the number of different cell towers that you visited during the reference period or during different points of time. the overall kind of like radius of gyrations, the average distance traveled over the reference period. It can give you an idea of how mobile a person is. Likewise, there's some interesting stuff that that this can tell you about social networking in terms of the total, how many unique contacts are you contacting. Maybe someone who is doing more business on the phone is going to have a larger number of unique contacts as opposed to someone who's using it for primarily like personal reasons, and where it's going to be the same contacts you're contacting over and over. So this is just to give a kind of a flavor of just how much, how big this data is. It's there's so many different variations of features, and so you really do need some of the. It's one of the reasons why I think machine learning makes a lot of sense for analyzing these data. So kind of so what are we trying to predict? What are the outcomes that we're focused on? And so we've identified. There's quite a few. I mean, this is kind of just a taste of what we can eventually do. There's a lot more nuance. There's a lot more kind of different dimensions that are captured in the phone survey data that we will be able to analyze. But so far, this is what we have. And so we have, 3 binary and 3 continuous variables that we're focusing on. We have, whether the user, the respondent, is currently employed. And this is based on kind of having done any economic activity over the last 7 days, whether they're currently unemployed. And here we're using kind of an ILO definition that, you're unemployed if you don't engage in any activity, but you are, willing to carry out activities. You're trying to find employment, and you would be available to take up employment if presented with an opportunity. Otherwise, you would be considered outside of the labor force. And we also have some questions on. We included some questions on informal employment. This is we're kind of. I mean, we're tweaking this definition, I think, as we move forward. But right now, the way we defined it is pretty strict, where we consider a job as informal if it does not include any of the following, like a written or verbal contract, provide health insurance, entitlement to paid leave, or entitlement to Social Security benefits. Continuous variables where we have hours, it's just the total hours worked in the last 7 days. And then we have GSS was really interested in capturing commuting time. So we also have we have 2 variables here on the morning and evening commutes. So the minutes that you typically spent traveling between home and your place of work. I should note that when we're talking about work here, when we're talking about employment here, it's not just it's pretty broad. So it's including any like farming, livestock, or fishing activities for profit or for subsistence, for own use or for sale, running a non-farm business or helping without pay in a non-farm business, as well as working as an employee for pay, and also paid and unpaid apprenticeship. So this is based on kind of like ILO standards, and we're trying to capture any kind of economic activity. So some descriptive statistics based on the phone survey, and then I'm going to hand over to Lindy to take us through the machine learning stuff. So we find that sampled men and women are on average similar in age, around 35 years old. Women are slightly more likely to have to ask permission to use the phone, though it's rare for both. It's 7% for men and 8% for women. Men are more likely to always carry the phone with them outside the home by about 4%, and men are slightly also more likely to conduct business on the phone, though again it's pretty rare for it's surprising. This was lower than what I expected, but it's low, relatively low for men and women both, 6% men and 4% women. Also, I think, again, it's kind of interesting and surprising was that women were considerably more likely to, so men were, considerably more likely than women to use more than one phone. That's also, that may have, we'll want to, we want to keep that in mind kind of as we go through the results. So in terms of kind of our binary labor market indicators, women are less likely than men to be employed and more likely to be unemployed. And about a quarter of respondents, both male and female, reported engaging in informal employment. But again, we're using a really strict definition here. So if we relax that, we may actually, I'm surprised that we didn't see a gender gap here. So if we relax that definition, we may in the future see, like this finding may change. We do see some, big differences, gender differences in terms of hours worked. Women, worked on average almost 8 fewer hours in the past 7 days than men. And they also tended to, work closer to the home. So they had shorter commuting times. So those are the descriptives, and I'm going to hand off to Lindy now to take us through the complicated stuff that's above my head.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I will talk about results. First, I just want to quickly introduce the models that we used. So I'll start with our baseline model, and then I'll work up to more complicated models. So in each of these models, we're trying to predict two things. We're trying to predict gender, of course, which I'm going to denote as a G, and we are trying to predict labor market indicators, which I will be denoting with a Y. So as Greg just explained, we have really two main types of labor market indicators that we want to talk about. There's the continuous labor market indicators, things like hours worked, and then there's the binary labor market indicators, things like whether or not they're employed. So for this baseline model, we are going to use a logistic regression, as you do, to predict gender with a logit link, and I've got that described there using statistical notation on the left-hand side with those formulas. And then we will use two other traditional models to model the labor market indicators. So for a continuous labor market indicator, we'll use an ordinary linear model. We use all of the covariates, all of the explanatory variables that Greg talked about for that phone trace data. We don't include any interactions just because there are so many X variables. And we do something similar for the binary labor market indicators, and we fit a logistic regression. Okay, and those two models for the employment indicators are on the right-hand side of the slide. So again, this is what we refer to as our baseline model that we use to compare with our machine learning models. Greg, would you mind switching? I forgot I don't have, there we go. Okay, our next model is called a Bayesian additive regression tree, which we refer to as BART. So this is a non-parametric alternative to linear models. So our goal is the same. We want to predict gender. We want to predict labor market indicators, continuous or binary. But these are what we call non-parametric, which means we really aren't making as many assumptions about how the X variables are related to the Y variables through things like nonlinearity, interactions, things like that. So I do have a tree represented in a diagram in this slide. And the reason I'm showing that tree is because the foundation of BART is trees. It's a lot of trees, so you can think of it as a forest. But in this tree, we want to read this from top down. So the first thing we split on is a variable called x1. And if that x1 is small, we go to the left, and then we additionally split on x2. So that's just one example of a hypothetical, very, very simple tree. So a couple things I want to note about building trees. Within each tree, there's automatic variable selection, which is really nice. We just heard Greg talk about how there are so many variables from that phone trace data. It'd be really nice if there was some way we could automatically choose the important ones from the not important ones. A tree is only going to split on a variable if it's important, if it increases that accuracy or reduces the error. Similarly, each tree is going to automatically incorporate interactions. So in my example I have plotted here, you can see that X2 matters. We are splitting on X2, but only when X1 is small. So that's an interaction right there, right? The effect of X2 depends on what X1 is doing. That's an interaction. So the linear models don't incorporate those things automatically, but BART does, or any tree-based model does. And in the same way, it's also going to accommodate highly nonlinear relationships if needed. So, a nonlinear relationship, for example, would be X1, right? There's not a linear relationship between X1 and the response, it's stepped. And of course, this can get more complicated with more trees and larger trees within that BART model. So what we're going to do is we are going to employ independent BART models for gender and separately for the labor market indicators. And just really quickly, before I lose you, I do want to bring your attention to these formulas over on the right-hand side. The first formula is how we are predicting the probability of being a female. The second row you see there is predicting a continuous labor market income. And then the third formula is predicting a binary labor market outcome. So within these formulas, you can see that we are summing over trees. Okay, so T1 all the way up to T. That's how many trees we have. And within those summations, we don't need to get into the nitty gritty, but I do want you to notice some syntactual differences here. For the top row where we're predicting gender, you can see that we have our own tree structure. That's that capital T, and that's collecting, X1 less than 0.32, X2 less than 0.4. Those are those splitting rules, okay? And we can see that in each of these formulas, they all have their own splitting rules. And it might not be clear why I'm bringing that up now, but it will be on the next slide. So between gender and the two labor market indicators, they all have different tree structures and different, of course, means and probabilities at the bases of those trees. Okay, with that being said, Greg, we can now go on to the next slide. Thank you. So in the last two models, you'll notice that we model gender independently from the labor market indicators, and that's fine. That's what's traditionally done. But you might be thinking, hey, there's some lost information there. Things that are associated with gender might also be the same things that are associated with the labor market indicators. Or in other words, for example, something that drives unemployment might be the same sort of thing that's associated with gender. So they could share that information and build a stronger model. With that logic, we introduce what's called a shared forest model. So a shared forest model is actually not any more complicated than what we've been talking about. It's a single model that's going to model both gender and the labor market indicator simultaneously. It's a bivariate model in other words. It is an implementation of BART. So it's a bivariate BART implementation. So here's the important part. In these shared forest models, the way it leverages shared information is by sharing tree structures. So those binary splitting rules, so, X1 less than 0.32, X2 less than 0.4, those splits are shared between gender and the employment indicator. So if the same things are driving gender and labor or associated with gender and labor, you've got some strength there, right? Because they can build on each other and use that shared information. But I will note, if different things are driving them or associated with them, then this isn't really warranted and it won't really help us, because at the end of the day, this shared forest model is actually a simplification of BART. There are fewer parameters, there are more restrictions. So we really only win out if that simplification is warranted, and that's all I'll say there. Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide. Thank you. Okay, now for some results. The first results we'll talk about is in the accuracy of gender prediction. So in this plot, on the y-axis, we have accuracy. And again, we're not looking at the labor market indicators yet. We are looking at gender. And we are doing this for all three models. So the traditional logistic regression, the parallel BART models, and then the shared forest. So yeah, right off the bat, you're going to see that our machine learning models, our BART and shared forest, they're not winning out. Okay, they don't do as well as the logistic regression. It's not a huge difference. It's about a 2 percentage point difference, but it's consistent. Okay, which with almost every employment indicator, that logistic regression wins out. And even so, our accuracy isn't great. It does teeter around that 66 percentage point. And I should mention, I forgot to mention at the beginning, the way that we obtained these box plots what we did is we split our whole data set 30 times into training and testing. And for each one of those splits, we collected an accuracy. So I should have said that to begin with. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about labor market indicators. And we'll start with talking about continuous labor market indicators. So in this case, we're again working with those 30 train test splits. And for each train test split, what we did in this plot is we looked at the correlation between the truth. So for example, their true hours in employment, and then what we predicted in that test set. And we got the correlation between them. So correlation is something that ranges between -1 and +1. Ideally, it's positive when you're trying to predict something, and ideally it's closer to 1. So I won't sugarcoat this. They're not big, okay? They're around 0.1, which is not considered a large correlation. That's a weak correlation between what we're predicting and what we want to predict. But on the other hand, our machine learning models do seem to have some gains over the more traditional ordinary linear regression model. We do see the shared forest and BART having some advantages over that traditional model. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, when we're working with continuous indicators, we could look at correlation, but we can also look at root mean squared error. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide because I know we are a little bit constrained. Root mean squared error is something you want smaller. So once again, we do see some moderate gains with BART and the shared forest. So I think, Greg, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, finally, if you remember, we also have binary employment indicators in addition to those continuous employment indicators. So this is things like employment, informal work, underemployed, unemployment. And on the y-axis, I no longer have accuracy. We used accuracy when we were gauging how well we could predict gender, but now we are using something called AUC. Now, Greg mentioned this earlier in the slideshow. A lot of these things are rare events, okay? Being underemployed, being unemployed, having informal work. Those are rare events, which means, you know, we don't have very many ones and we have a lot of zeros, or the other way around. So in that case, accuracy is actually not a very appropriate tool. It can be really misleading. We look like we have really, really high accuracy, even though we're actually not having a very sophisticated tool. So we look at something called AUC, that's area under the curve. And essentially, this is something that ranges naturally between 0 and 1, and we want it to be bigger. And the advantage is that we consider both the probability we identify it and it's there, and the probability we don't identify it and it's not there. Okay, so you might hear a data scientist saying it respects both sensitivity and specificity. Just really quickly, I'll note we do see some gains, some moderate gains for the BART and the shared forest model over that logistic regression. But as Greg said, you know, there are areas for improvement, in particular with these machine learning models. We're using all the defaults. So with more time, we hope to do a little bit more fine tuning and hopefully get some better performance. All right, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Lindy. So I'm just going to sum up and then we can jump into discussion. So I think, you know, as Lindy has kind of talked to us about, you know, we still have some questions about how, like, you know, based on these results about how well, you know, at least in our sample or the mobile phone data are able to predict these types of labor market behavior. You know, we can't, you know, you can't compare across different studies. It's, you know, you have different data, different samples. The predictions we're seeing, the accuracy we're seeing for gender is was around, you know, in the 60%, around, you know, 66, 60, like high 60s. It's not that in itself is not so different from what others have found also. You know, it's maybe a bit lower than kind of some of the figures in some of these other studies. But again, it's hard to compare across studies. We don't really have any kind of comparison when it comes to the labor market indicators. So there we're really kind of having to come up with our own ways of you know, evaluating like what's good enough. It certainly seems like what we're at now, especially with in terms of like the continuous variables, it would not be kind of reliable enough to base any kind of policy decisions on. We're doing better for the binary, so maybe there is, you know, more hope there. But at any rate, like we need there's a lot more refinement, like Lindy was saying, that can be done, and that's what we have planned for the next few months. And so I have a few steps here, and then I'll end. So one is, so far we haven't really, we have the results are, are not disaggregated. So we're not looking at kind of like the predictions for men or predictions for women specifically. So that's something we can do. We also, again, we're going to look at kind of different types of work. So we can look at kind of like, formal and informal employment, as well as like ag and non-ag. And you can think, particularly, and we've done a little bit of this, but we're not so far along that we wanted to share it. But I think conceptually, we can think about how, mobile phone data could potentially be more predictive of certain types of employment, certain types of work than others. If it involves more, traveling around, or actually involves using the phone. And so we can also disaggregate kind of by these phone usage data that I mentioned, carrying the phone outside the home, using it for business. So these are all kind of disaggregations that we want to look at more closely to see if there are pockets in the sample where we are doing, where we are predicting better than elsewhere. Also want to see about, if there's other, data that can be added. So, this is proved helpful for some of the poverty mapping exercises. And so we're gonna try to follow that path too, and see if it helps. So we're gonna, look at kind of incorporating publicly available remote sense data that's likely to be, associated with labor market behavior. This could be things like nighttime lights, even climatic conditions, and possibly, distance to roads or urban areas. Obviously, kind of a next step, well, like down the road for us, is to expand these predictions to the full universe of MTN subscribers, which I talked about. We also, we surveyed, 8,000, phone like MTN subscribers. We don't, it would be helpful to kind of validate, so that gave us some idea about, the labor force participation within, those data. But it would be helpful if we're thinking about this more broadly as representative of Ghana as a whole, to kind of validate these surveys, these results with in data from the the recent population and housing census. That will assume we're gonna we talk with GSS about potentially getting being able to do that. That's all I have. So thank you. I'm sorry we went over time, and looking forward to some quick discussion.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Lindy, for the good presentation. Let me open it up to the floor now and take questions. I actually see 2 questions in the chat. I believe Josh's questions was covered by the presentation, but feel free to just type in if you have follow-up questions. And then we have another question from Hazel. I don't know if Greg, if you could see that. She asked if the hours worked are capturing only paid work.
No, so hours worked, it's capturing, work in any of these, activities that we mentioned. So it's, ag, non-ag, own use, for sale, own business, all of these. It's any type of work, just like this would be. So very broad.
Sorry, just to follow up. So just to clarify, so domestic work is not included, like care work?
Yeah, paid work, yes. Yeah, so no, we don't have data on, so I missed that. Yeah, that's the point. No, I didn't, okay. We don't have, sorry.
I was just surprised because it said, women were working less, and I imagined that would be because there were some types of women's work that's not captured. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we're not able to, we didn't, because we were we were trying to, we're seeing this as kind of filling data gaps related to kind of like labor market statistics. We focused on the paid work and not the unpaid work.
Okay, Musna, your hand is up.
Yeah, hi. I had a related question to what Hazel asked. So then I guess this data is also capable of capturing home-based paid work, right? I mean, and also just, I guess, wondering if any surveys, labor statistics surveys have been done in Ghana in the past, what is the proportion of women who are engaged in home-based paid work? So that proportion is very high in India, especially among, certain communities, for example, religious minorities, the proportion of women who are doing home-based paid work in sort of small home-based enterprises, or what they call cottage industries, is very high, and so this data wouldn't allow you to capture that. Am I right? And do you know from sort of larger household surveys what proportion of women are engaged in that kind of?
I mean, I don't have any hard data, except the same, like what you were mentioning, and my impression. I mean, we know that women are doing a higher proportion of their labor, at the home. We don't, so what we can predict what it's based on what we ask about in the phone survey. And so we didn't, we make a distinction between, we make a distinction between whether it's like own use or for sale, but we didn't, we didn't include anything. We weren't able to include questions on. We're trying to keep the survey so short. We didn't include a question on where the primary place effect like work happened. Although you say this, and it's like we might actually be able to infer that from the commuting times actually. But that may be something we want to look into.
All right, thanks. Hazel had a follow-up question, also following up on Josh's question earlier. So Lendy explained that gender is one of the outcomes being predicted, but can you clarify whether you're able to validate that using the survey data? Is that the truth part you talked about?
Greg, you might be better suited to answer this question. Okay. It's my understanding that the survey data does have their true gender, and we don't have to rely on that SIM card, which might not be the truth, but
that's exactly right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we're talking about, when we're validating with yeah, I mean, the survey does include, the phone survey included, gender. So we know from that data who that's the gender of the primary user of that phone. So we know that that's the truth part. We don't have, so the other part of this that we talked about that we haven't captured here, that we haven't talked about, is that potentially we could look at, we could show what the difference is between the who was registered for the phone versus who actually identified as the primary user. We're not using we're not using the SIM registration info in the model as of yet, though that's something that we have discussed as maybe it's worth looking into, but yeah, you're right that we're capturing gender in the phone survey.
Okay, thanks. Musna just added a comment. Yeah, don't know if you're able to see it. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at ILO's modeled estimates, and it says self-employment is as high as 80% of female employment in Ghana. So that's potentially a high proportion of women who may be working from home.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think that's why I'm really looking, I mean, I think I'm hopeful that when we disaggregate the results more along the lines that I talked about, that we are going to see there being, certain types of employment, especially for women, that we are able to predict better than others. It's an empirical question, so we'll have to see if it bears out. But I mean, I do think it makes sense to me that the CDR is, really, its phone usage is gonna look quite different, depending on where you're working, the types of work that you're doing. So yeah, I think it's an interesting direction for us to take.
Greg, if you don't mind, I'll chime in quickly here. It seems like a lot of the questions are around how we elicit information on employment and what specifically that entails. So I just put the actual question in the chat box, and kind of the short of that is that it should capture home-based employment as well. And actually it captures both work for pay and without pay as well too.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Heath.
Thanks for that clarification. Do we have any other questions or comments? I think we have like a little bit of time. Maybe we can take one question. But if we don't have any more, we can, of course, just end it here. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, Greg and Lindy, for this great presentation. And of course, thanks everyone again for joining the webinar today. And as mentioned, the engendering data features both blogs and webinars throughout the year. So if you like to publish a blog or do a webinar and this seems like a good fit for you, please reach out to us. And any other final comments, Greg, Lindy? You're all good?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, thanks everybody. Hope to see you all at our next webinar.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.